What would a post-American world and a post-Ukrainian geopolitics be like? For years now, political scientists, including Americans, have been talking about a post-American world. The Ukrainian crisis and its impending outcome suggest a new quality of geopolitics, since the indirect involvement of the United States in this conflict leads to a defeat of Kiev and a defeat for the United States. After the defeat of Napoleon's France and Hitler's Germany, this is the last missing link in the chain of clarification of relations between the West and Russia in the field of political power. After that, it's possible to talk about a new morality in the world and European politics, which will be preceded by a period of non-confrontation. Hence, psychological adaptation of the Western elites to this reality, complicated by euphoria of victory in the Cold War, quote unquote, and the illusion of the monopolar moment that has shaped current generations of Western politicians. What might the current narrative of international relations consist of until everything falls into place in the coming and already emerging world order? Firstly, driven by a deep historical tradition of containing and at times dismembering Russia, the West, with the United States taking the lead from Germany and Britain in the post-war period, has consciously chosen a dual expansion, NATO and the European Union, as assurance against the resurgence of a powerful Russia and the restoration of its position as a world power. The current crisis was predictable. George Kennan, who laid the theoretical foundations for a policy of containment with the 1946 long telegram from the American embassy in Moscow, considered the decision to expand of NATO the most fatal in American policy in the post-Cold War period. Secondly, historically, the current crisis completes the cycle of Russian containment dating back to World War I, one of the main goals of which was to prevent Berlin from, according to the logic of the Thucydidean trap, Russia's strong economic rise, comparable to current China, rise resulting from Stolypin's reforms, as well as those that preceded it, the abolition of serfdom and the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II. The country had a strong position in world trade, in the grain and oil market. It had a strong currency, and the economic growth rate was around 10%, which is pretty good. London provoked the outbreak of war by its ambiguous position in relation to alliance obligations towards France, which was in military alliance with Russia. Berlin was convinced until the last moment that the British would stay away if they declared war on Russia. Securing from the British a public declaration to this effect was the main task of the mission of the Russian ambassador to London, Alexander Benkendorf, which was never fulfilled. The Germans knew that Russia could only be crushed from within, and that is why they collaborated with Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. The British, for their part, took part in this work as part of Lord Milner's expedition in January to February 1917, participating in the conspiracy of Duma liberals against Nicholas II the Tsar, which took the form of the February Revolution and the abdication of the Tsar, which became the point of no return for the destabilization of Russia. The liberals paved the way for the Bolsheviks to take power. London's purpose was to prevent a successful spring-summer offensive by the Russian military and to prevent Russia from gaining the geopolitical benefits associated with the defeat of Germany and its allies, notably control of the Black Sea Straits. Thus, the Russian Revolution, which interrupted the country's evolutionary development, was the result of a complex conspiracy by external forces using various segments of Russia's still immature and heterogeneous political class. Thirdly, the conflict between Russia and the West has a cultural and civilizational dimension dating back to the schism of the Ecumenical Church back in 1054 AD. It was one church at that time, one Christian church, then became Catholic and Christian Orthodox at that time. The capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204 and its fall in 1453, when Orthodoxy had already gained strategic depth in the Grand Duchy of Moscow of Russia. So we're talking about the different fortunes of Christianity in the West, where the Reformation finally prevailed, marking the return to the Old Testament and to the East, mainly in Russia. Fyodor Tykchev in the mid 19th century defined the relationship between Russia and the West, which is shared by many Western elites, including, judging by recent developments, as follows: by the very fact of its existence, Russia denies the future of the West. Thus, the conflict between the West and Russia throughout its duration, regardless of the moments of convergence, of which there were many in the 20th century, including the Russian Revolution, comparable in importance to the Reformation, was cultural, and as far as one can judge from the developments after the Cold War, it cannot have any other positive outcome than the peaceful coexistence tested in it. The unipolar illusion of the historical West, on the other hand, and the restoration by modern Russia of the bond of time and historical continuity in relation to the entire pre-evolutionary period, on the other, determine the seriousness of the current conflict, its existential character for both parts. Furthermore, the development of Western society itself over the last 50 years at least testifies in favor of Western civilization entering the age of decline. It was predicted by O. Spengler in his work The Decline of the West, according to which the 21st and the following centuries will be characterized, among other things, by the internal disintegration of nations into an amorphous population and the slow penetration of primitive states to a highly civilized way of life. All this is accompanied by a crisis of culture, the beginning of which dates back to the destruction of traditional society in the wake of the French revolutions, of the subsequent revolutions of the 19th century. Aristocratic criticism of Western democracy, particularly with the observations of the French political scientist A. de Tocqueville, who noted in his work Democracy in America that freedom of opinion does not exist in America, where the majority creates impressive obstacles in this. This feature of American consciousness and political culture is quite evident in the phenomenon such as McCarthyism, and now manifests itself in the form of political correctness, including the position of new values and apologetic political movements such as Black Lives Matter, BLM. Fourth, taking into account these cultural factors means turning to the philosophy of postmodernism. M. Foucault, J. Derrida, J. Baudrillard, and J. Agamemnon, and not to mention the fact that they arose from American material and were a reaction of left European, mainly French, political thought to the destruction of Nazism, from which Europe was not protected by centuries of culture. The main evidence: commandant of a Nazi concentration camp, read Goethe in his spare time. These concepts, ecstasy, optimism, deconstruction, etc., are quite applicable to the analysis of contemporary international relations. Baudrillard's work is particularly important in this regard. It contains the thesis that fatal strategies, rooted in the history and destinies of peoples and states, prevail over commonplaces and the strategic rules of the game they impose. It perfectly explains Russia's victory over Napoleon and Nazi Germany. Brillard's predictions have implications for practical politics, such as the recreation of the human space of war in the shadow of nuclear confrontation. Ignoring this has resulted in the West and NATO being unprepared for the big war in Europe using conventional weapons, as shown by the reaction to the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, and the arms race becomes technological mannerism. This best describes today's geostrategic situation, its dilemmas and imperatives. In general, it's about overcoming the postmodern virtual existence of the West and the world and the transition to the neo-modern, that is, to the ground of reality and facts. Russia and its politics serve as a powerful catalyst at this turning point in global development, and in fact to emancipate the world from the lingering and becoming brake on U.S. Western dominance in global politics, economics, and finance. Fifth, The most important point is that it is liberalism with its uniformity and balancing and not traditional conservatism that lies at the heart of totalitarianism, including fascism and Nazism. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 is proof. This is proven by the crisis of modern liberalism, which manifests itself most strongly in America. It is degenerating into a purely totalitarian dictatorship of liberal elites opposed to the majority of the electorate that proclaims common sense and traditional conservative values, including the family, despite the rampant pressure of the LGBT community with the support of official circles. Here comes Dosto's brilliant foresight, Yevsky in The Possessed, and The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, which, like George Orwell's warnings, have a universal significance for European civilization, highlighting as fundamental, at the level of worldview and political culture, its flaws. America was founded by Protestant fanatics, followers of Calvin, who had no place in the British Isles as part of the domestic settlement after the English Revolution and subsequent restoration, in the form of the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689, which became a coup with the summons of William of Orange and the capture of London by his troops. These fanatics declared that they were God's chosen people, quote unquote. Although this position in Christianity is occupied, past capital income and general business success as grace, and denied the right to salvation and even life to everyone else. Therefore, there is the idea that America is great and that the kingdom of God on earth is possible. This contrasts with the assertion, already in the post-war period, of the universality of its values and consequently the imperialist policy of the United States outside North America since the end of the 19th century. This contradiction, which served as a driving force behind America's post-war foreign policy, has in the past been resolved by a policy of isolationism more organic to traditional American identity. This was supported by President Andrew Jackson, who believed that America should influence the world only by its example. A follower of Andrew Jackson was Donald Trump, who focused on recreating the internal foundations of national competitiveness and considered the world a world of powerful sovereign states, quote unquote, competing with each other, which is close to the concept of multipolarity. In fact, it was about demilitarizing national security doctrine itself as a legacy of the Cold War. Experts were in favor of it under Obama. Thus, Admiral Mullen, chief of the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff, spoke of the need to engage in national building at home. Globalization was deemed wrong because, driven by the interests of the investing classes, it led to the destruction of the middle class, or more specifically, native white American. Its main beneficiary has been China, which has used U.S. Western investment, technology, and even markets for its peaceful rise. In the foreign policy tradition of the post-war period, it became enemy number one in the evil empire that required its preventive containment according to the logic of the Thucydides trap. The coronavirus pandemic only intensified the trend towards deglobalization that Russia entered with a policy of sovereign self-sufficiency under the pressure of Western sanctions. Outside this black and white vision of the world remained Russia, which is perceived by many in the conservative environment as a possible opponent in the triangular diplomacy of the United States, Russia, and China. In this day, Kissinger laid the foundation for such diplomacy when he worked out a settlement with Beijing on an anti-Soviet basis. Now we have to talk about partnership with Russia. Number 6, Washington's anti-Russian course, which led to the Ukraine project and the current escalation, cannot be understood outside the context of the domestic situation of contemporary America. After a brief conservative Trump revolution, a future that casts its shadow before it arrives, the liberal elites led by the Democratic Party have prevailed. Under the administration of Barack Obama, Washington bet on the aggressive nationalist transformation and even Nazization of Ukraine as a means to threaten Russia at the level of identity and history to determine the spiritual and moral foundation of modern Russia, which is the victory in the Great Patriotic War, and to retroactively restore Nazism as a specific product of Western civilization, equating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. Accordingly, this course was activated after the 2020 US presidential election, which was won by the Democrats. Since the late 1970s, median household income in the United States has stagnated. Beginning in the early 1980s, US elites began to deregulate, or rather recreate under new conditions, the capitalism of the pre-Great Depression model of the 1930s. By the year 2000, the Glass-Steagall Act, which regulated the financial sector, was eventually abolished. Globalization has worsened the situation. As a result, the United States, and with it, to a large extent, the European Union, received a financialization of the economy, an erosion of the middle class, and a stagnation of consumer demand. All this culminated in the global financial crisis of 2008, which is still ongoing, having practically exhausted the traditional means of macroeconomic regulation. In a sense, the ruling cosmopolitan elites have become disconnected from the national territory and the interests of the majority of the population. At the political level, the marches of the two main political parties have been measured. Politics has become essentially non-alternative, with an emphasis on political technology, undermining the trust of the electorate in the elites, who in turn, under the slogan, political correctness, has engaged in suppression of free speech and suppression of dissent, acting primarily through the controlled traditional media. In 2020 election, the election was a turning point for the domestic political evolution in the United States, the liberal elites having learned the lessons from Trump, who appealed to his electorate by bypassing traditional media through social networks, acting with blatant fraud and manipulation primarily through mass mail-in voting and support from marginalized populations, African Americans, and other ethnic minorities. Abolition culture, critical race theory, and other ideological products serve the interests of the new regime and its social base at the expense of the interests of white Native America, which was called upon to accept the new values as progressive development, quote unquote, of traditional conservative values. In essence, there was a new ultra-liberal American Revolution, similar in radicalism and methods to the Bolshevik Revolution. As in Russia 100 years ago, in the US, the marginalized were led by the progressive intelligentsia, quote unquote. Of course, in relation to the Trump Revolution, we're talking about a counter-revolution and a conservative process initiated by the elites to save a clear transcendence of liberalism that can only be achieved through the reshaping of national identity and the rewriting of history, that is, of the breaking of the bond of time and the rejection of historical continuity. We're talking about a new and possibly decisive stage of what American political scientists themselves defined as a cultural revolution and non-civil war, the beginning of which goes back to the presidency of Bill Clinton, 1992 to 2000. The most important factor in the current situation is the loss by the white, mainly Anglo-Saxon and Protestant population of their majority in America in the foreseeable future. Circumstances clearly call for decisive measures inside the country, including the censorship of social networks and the legitimization of domestic politics by presenting it as part of a global trend, hence its ultra-liberal world revolution. It's worth remembering that the Bolsheviks initially, that they do not believe they could hold power in the country outside the context of the coming world revolution. In the wake of the Ukrainian crisis, Fukuyama conceived the idea of social liberalism as a possibility for liberalism to take root on national soil that strongly resembles Nazism in its modern form, and an attempt to restore Nazism, neo-Nazism in Ukraine and modern Europe in its entirety. The problem of identity and history is acute for the West because of the highly contradictory results of globalization and neoliberal economic policies, which according to independent political scientists can be seen as a counter-revolution to the post-war social contract with socially oriented its economy. This is also demonstrated by the contradictions between cosmopolitan elites and the majority rooted in their countries and regions. These contradictions are exacerbated as immigration increases with today's labor surplus. At the same time, traditionalism maintains its influence at the level of elites and their foreign policy philosophy and instincts. These are essentially vestiges of imperial thinking, whether it's a desire to maintain nuclear power status, Britain and France, and gain a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, Germany and Japan, or a borrowing from ancient China of the sense of middle place in world architecture, United States. As the British broadcaster J. Paxman aptly noted, Britain itself seeks to remain what it was in the days of empire, quote, only in a reduced form, end quote. American elites probably experience something similar, although they have an alternative, the tradition of isolationism. In any case, the story factor plays a role, although to a different extent for different countries. Thus, a leading political columnist of the Financial Times, Jay Ruckman, trying to draw lessons from Brexit, joins Britain and Russia in the category of historical powers that must be dealt with accordingly, either integrated into the international system on decent terms or be prepared to restrain or oppose them. It's the latest choice Washington has made regarding regarding Russia, in other words, to oppose them. Seventh, Washington's anti-Russian policies under all administrations have reflected the dictates of this complex domestic crisis. Thanks to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, which created the illusion of a world without alternatives in terms of ideas and development models, the West received a kind of second wind. Its resource was exhausted for 30 years, during which the trend towards multipolarity was consolidated, the symbols of which are the rise of China and the restoration of Russia's position as a world power that manifested itself in the most sensitive to the self-consciousness of Western elite zone of political power, Crimea, Donbass, and Syria. In this context, under Obama, the creation of two commercial and economic blocs in the West and the East, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would solve the problem of Western dominance in the world politics, economy, and economics, was bet on in the new historical conditions while limiting Russia and China. He was thinking something in the spirit of the forts of the West. Those plans were abandoned by the Trump administration. The momentum was largely lost. Beijing stepped up its efforts in APEC, pushing for a comprehensive regional economic partnership under its auspices and with the support of ASEAN, while in Europe the credibility of American leadership was undermined. There, the EU-China investment agreement was initiated in the end of November 2019. The approved unity of the West on anti-Russian grounds in relation to the events in Ukraine acts as a kind of revenge from Washington for the aforementioned geopolitical blunders of Trump. With the arrival of Biden in the White House, the Americans began to repair their informal global empire in an effort no longer relying on the automation of expanding their control over the world. The fallacy of such a primitive calculation was indirect. It was recognized even by Kissinger. With more aggressive containment of China and Russia to achieve this second wind again, the rebuilding of their geostrategic strongholds in the Euro-Atlantic and APEC. The stakes in Western politics have skyrocketed and become, without exaggeration, existential in nature. He has realized that the West is faced with the prospect of a war on two fronts, which Germany failed to withstand twice, under the Kaiser and under Hitler. Now the Western elites found themselves united, with Germany and Japan under American occupation and political control, in a world that had become largely multipolar. Eighth, in the post-war period, an aggressive, essentially imperial foreign policy, philosophy and tradition of grand strategy had developed in the United States, this time a sort of a new Turks from political science, such as Jake Sullivan, Wes Mitchell, and others from the infamous Marathon Initiative, came at the helm and accused the previous generation of losing to Beijing and Moscow, including Ukraine. They came up with their own ideas on how to improve the situation and a corresponding grand strategy. W. Mitchell is the author of the strategy to avoid war on two fronts. In his terminology, it is a problem of simultaneous existence of two wars. Because American resources do not allow such a thing to be carried out, it is supposed to fight Russia in Ukraine to stop its expansion westward. Obviously, this means strengthening our position in the post-Soviet space and relations with the EU, especially with Germany. That is, to start with a weaker adversary, to force Moscow to turn to the east, penetrate the development of Siberia and the Far East, and not even object to the supply of Russian weapons to India. Apparently, this strategy is being pursued by the Biden administration. According to Mitchell himself, he proposed this idea to the Pentagon under Trump in the fall of 2020, after he resigned as Assistant Secretary of State a year earlier. During Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, it has already been openly stated that the West's goal is to inflict a strategic or even military defeat on Russia and in Ukraine, which with varying degrees of probability will destabilize and soften in terms of its willingness to serve Western interests. Ninth, the situation has been characterized as a trap within a trap strategy, or fatal versus a trivial strategy. Washington believed that in the case of Afghanistan, it would provoke Russia to invade Ukraine, where it would be trapped or forced to withdraw without achieving its stated goals. At the same time, the West itself found itself provoked by the pressure of sanctions from hell, undermining the foundations of its global dominance. The system is losing its basic feature, the universality that existed even during the Cold War, which suggests an entirely new quality of confrontation and the very threat to the West, as well as revealing the scale of trade and economic and monetary interdependence, mainly in the energy sector, in terms of mineral fertilizers and food supplies. The revenge, quote-unquote, of anti-Russian sanctions leads to higher inflation and cost of living, and consequently social political tensions in Western countries, providing Russia with an effective means to influence their domestic situation. The West's surprise war against Russia has failed. As a result of the banality of the game, like Germany in World War I and II, the West is in a state of war on two fronts. When China, due to the West's quagmire in the conflict with Russia, gains liberties to solve Taiwan's problem by force, which is the main factor in its containment by the Americans. Thus, the prospect of the collapse of the entire post-war foreign policy structure of the United States and Europe, including the G7, NATO, the EU, and other civil military alliances, IMF, IB, WTO, and other institutions, is clearly indicated. Accordingly, for the West itself, the UN system becomes more important. Moreover, the West is in a position of weakness, forced to resort to international law, which additionally ensures the sustainability of UN for the future. The G20 summit format also serves as the last stand-in for the existing world order and as a vehicle for its smooth transformation. The alternative is chaos, hence the lack of control, which is a nightmare for Western elites and above all for Americans who are lost in any situation they do not control, even if that control is illusionary. Characteristic of post-war American politics and strategic culture. This is from Oriental Review, Terra Papers. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.